Today I'm going to talk about 3 different approaches for you to get good at pretty much anything you want. The first approach is my recommended approach, especially for those with ADHD or some form of neurodivergence. The second approach is a bit more structured, but not too crazy. And the third approach is very intense, but it works quite well. I'll explain how I mix these and assign them to different things in my life for maximum results, and hopefully you can draw something from that and cater it to your own life. As always, with anything I say on this channel or anything on the internet in general, adapt what you see to your own personal routine for the best results. Anyways, let's get started. To get right into approach number 1, I call this the 1 day at a time approach, which is my recommended approach. So who is this for? This approach is for people who are just getting into being disciplined or getting some sort of structure in their life. I also recommend this for people with ADHD or some form of neurodivergence. I say that because long-term planning and scheduling and all these routines, they typically only last for maybe a week or so for people who are neurodivergent. Then you abandon it and go on to something else, and that cycle tends to repeat. So it's better to take this 1 day at a time approach, and I'm going to lay out how that works in a second. Something to keep in mind too is that long-term thinking is great, but long-term planning, not so much. Don't get caught up in the definitions. What I basically mean is have an idea of where you want to be in life or at these skills or whatever it is, but don't try to lay out every step of the way, because that's going to change a lot. So how do we do this? We set extremely small goals for that day, complete them, and set another one if needed. Also, you'll want to log your days and not plan them out in the future. Overall, just focus on today and taking action. That's it. So I'm going to use guitar as an example because it's the most easy thing for me to do. I typically highlight my documents to look like this, but you can do however you want. Notice here I have a main theme, a general focus, and what I call a side quest. Main theme is triad fluency in all 12 keys. The general focus is G major, and the side quest is visualizing G major pentatonic across the neck of the guitar. A personal rule that I follow is that I split these things into 90-10. 90% of my practice time for the day or my effort for the day goes into whatever the main theme and general focus is. 10% is the side quest or the side option. I say side quest because I'm a gamer, but you can call it a subtask, you can call it secondary task, whatever you feel like calling it. I just call it a side quest. So why so specific with main theme, general focus, and right now focus? Well, your brain's probably gonna drift a lot as you do whatever you're doing. You think about something else you wanna do, productively procrastinate. You know, there's a lot of things that come up when we try to sit down and focus, especially the ADHD people. So having a right now activity is something that you really need to have in order to reshift back to something to do. I'll make that make sense in a second. Let's say today I want to learn G major triads, root, first inversion, and second inversion all across the neck. If you're not a guitar player, by the way, just try to break whatever you want to learn into different sections and pretend this is the first part. So as far as right now tasks, I list them out in checkboxes like this. I used to use a notebook and a sheet of paper for this years ago, so don't get caught up on trying to make your Notion or your Google documents look really pretty. It really doesn't matter. But what I'll do is have something like this, and I just get started, which will be this, first inversion, second inversion. And I just do that until I can get it down. An important note is that as a beginner, if you're a beginner at anything, it's not gonna look smooth. So most of this time will be spent really actively thinking through whatever you're doing. So if I don't know that this is a root position G major triad, what I'll sit there and do is identify the notes. Okay, G, I have B. I know D is the open string. That's the triad of G major in root position. Okay, first inversion. If you don't know what a first inversion is, you look it up, come back. Say, okay, here it is. Why is it a first inversion? Okay, G moves to the top. Now second inversion. Why is that a second inversion? Where is it? What are the notes? What are the frets? That kind of thing. These are things you want to work through slowly and efficiently until you can get it down pretty smooth. And then you can move on to the next task, which means I would click that box and I would go on to A minor triads. So A minor right here, you have another one here, and so on. I'm not gonna sit here and play all of these in a demonstration. That'll be in a future guitar video, but you get the point. But it's important to have something like that checkbox sitting there so you know whenever you start thinking about anything else, you have something exact to go back to. That's one of the keys to getting a lot of progress in whatever you're trying to do, especially if you have ADHD. Now, a quick note on the side tasks or side quests. I have mine labeled here as G major pentatonic. So this is the part where I would do something in G major just to visualize it better. Just whatever you can think of or whatever you know at the time, whatever comes to mind. Always keep that 10% and 90% rule in mind though. You don't want to get too sidetracked on noodling around on the side quest that you forget about your main theme and your general focus. And don't worry about structuring the side task. Eventually those things will become a main theme and general focus anyways, so you don't really have to sit there and like cater all this extra energy to it. Just keep it at its true 10%. So back to the general focus. Say this day that I have here in Notion, I get through the first and second subset of strings, or for whatever task you're doing, you get through the first block. The next day, I'll just log as I go and see how far I can get along that next two subset of strings in this case, or whatever you have listed in yours. For language, this may be something like vocabulary words. Maybe you got through 50 or 60 or 100 and just trying to see how quickly you can get to 4,000. I know that sounds crazy, but reference my language learning video for more information on that. I'm not gonna go into that right now. Just get the next step set up and then take action right away. Again, we're not trying to log out a bunch of days at a time. We're only focused on today. And sometimes what will happen is you log out too much that day and you don't get to it. That's totally okay. Just cut it off right there and move it to the next day. That's still a one day at a time approach. So in the guitar example, let's say I managed to finish my general focus on this day and I'm done with G major diatonic triads all across the neck. What I do is I type here in Notion that I finished with the general focus, or you can write it down in your notebook or whatever you have to track all this stuff. And then I just make a new general focus, which in this case, I would say something like D major triads, all the diatonic triads. And my new side quest are options like learn 2 songs from Polyphia or try to make a song or something like that. Again, 90% of this time you want to be focused on those main things because that's what's going to get you good. In some cases, you'll also need a new main theme too, of course, but this main theme in this example is still under triads. But say in the one I listed earlier, that side quest of G major pentatonic across the neck, if I completely did all my triads at that point and I needed a new main theme, this is the part where I would put G major pentatonic as the general focus and visualizing major pentatonics across the neck in every key as the main theme. Another quick note for side quests, some days, 100% of that day will be a side quest. It just happens. I do it all the time. I'm not gonna sit here and pretend like that 90-10% rule is exact and that I never break it. Overall, don't be so rigid with your approach. Keep these general concepts in mind, but don't punish yourself for not doing everything to the perfect checkbox or the perfect routine and all that. That doesn't really exist. All of this is like guidelines in a sense. Okay, let's get into some practice concepts. Practice should feel uncomfortable most of the time. I put this one first because it really means a lot overall for your progress. And I often find that when I'm not making progress, or really when anyone's not making progress, it's because we tend to stay in that little comfort zone a little too much. So if you know something, you kind of noodle around on it. You don't really expand on what you know, or you don't really seek out those uncomfortable things. And then it causes us to kind of stay in place. So we want to avoid that at all costs. Especially in today's trend of like, what is it, easy actually, and fast and easy, push this button for results. A bunch of the clickbait stuff going on these days. You want to just really realize that uncomfortable practice is what's going to give you the results. There's nothing easy or easy actually about it. I'm going to talk about this in my next video. That will be completely in Japanese, by the way, so if you want to see that, stay tuned. But this is just an idea I want you to keep in mind as you learn your crafts or whatever you're trying to get good at. So for example, let's use piano. I just use guitar, so let's use piano. If I want to improvise off 2 chords in the key of C, we'll say like F major 7, maybe a 9, or in C major 7. and maybe C major 9. If I can comfortably sit here and do this, and it doesn't really feel like a challenge anymore, this is the part where I move to a different key and try to figure something out. So for example, we'll say B major. But say I don't know how to improvise that, or I have to think a lot. This is the part where I make it uncomfortable. E major 7. And then I figure out, okay, I know this is the 6th chord. What are the notes of the 6th chord? I know this is the 1. I know this is the 1. Sorry, I missed a note there. And I know this is the 2. So I'll sit there and actively figure out what I'm doing. 4, 6, 1, 2. What are the notes of those? What are the intervals? What do those even mean? How do I play around with it? This is the part where you really want to make sure you're thinking and engaging your brain a lot. Because if you don't do this, you really won't make a lot of progress in the things that you're doing. So what's the point of all this? What's the point of this uncomfortable practice and all that kind of stuff? Well, over time, all of the things that you have to actively think about will become subconscious. Many of the difficult things that you know now, you used to have to think about it. Things like walking, things like maybe certain exercises you do, or languages you've already learned, or instruments you've already learned, or really anything. You probably had a time where you thought about it a lot and you thought about all of the little components, but it was really difficult for you. And now you can kind of do it to the point where you don't have to think about it much. Okay, the next practice concept is hard things first, easy things later, in terms of scheduling what you have to do throughout the day. So if you find it hard to sit down and practice your guitar or your piano, or you accidentally slip off and do something else before that, that's probably something you should do first, as soon as possible. Maybe wake up a bit earlier to practice, or do it at a convenient time where you don't have much else going on before you do other things. This is the time to do that hard task. Or maybe it's a language, or maybe it's just going to the gym. I know you have to schedule this stuff around your real life, whether you have a job or you're a student, but try to fit the more difficult tasks earlier in the day. I know something I used to do when I was in university years ago is I would actually wake up early and go to bed early. And what this helped me do is, before I went to school, I could do several of the things that I liked, because after school and after class and before work, I was just pretty much done. There was no way I was gonna finish a whole day of school or the part-time job I was working and then practice language or guitar or whatever. For me, that just didn't work. So I shifted my evening free time to the morning, and I would wake up like 3 o'clock, do all that, but I would go to sleep really early, so I still got plenty of sleep. It's just I kind of shifted my day a bit. Maybe keep that in mind, and that might help you out. I don't know how you can spend that for your own life, but try to keep that idea in mind. It may help you out. The most important concept of all of this is just doing something. It doesn't matter how you structure it or track it, just try to keep these ideas in mind and get moving on what you want to do. When I was learning some of these things, I didn't have documents and Notion and Google Docs and all that stuff. And when I learned guitar, actually, there were no guitar videos on YouTube. It had just came out, and I think it was only cat videos and like stuff you see in Fail Army and the Fail videos, people falling and all that stuff. That was YouTube. And so we took DVDs or books you buy from Guitar Center, and you just learn from those, and you track your progress on a sheet of paper, and you get moving. I learned a whole lot that way because there was no option overload. You just got something and then made really good use of it. So that's kind of what you want to mimic going along with this. Eventually, if you just keep practicing and you keep those concepts in mind, making it uncomfortable, practice things you don't know, stay focused on the main theme and the general focus, you'll be good eventually. You don't really have to worry about your progress too much. Okay, I'm gonna talk about why I recommend this approach for most people. Well, the main reason is you just have less clutter, mentally and physically, and it'll help you get out of that overthinking cycle. And this is what we want to do in order to get results. Next is you'll take way more action. I know I keep saying that, but this is the most important part of all of this. You have to take as much action as possible. Not just random things, but have some sort of a plan and then take action. You'll probably hear me say this 10 more times in this video. And a quick note on YouTube, when I did start learning things from YouTube, I pretty much did it in the format of the video I call Teach Yourself. I'll link it. But that's pretty much how I did it. I would make a course for myself or make a plan and just do that. And I would take 1 or 2 videos max and just take a bunch of time to really implement those videos into my life. Let's talk about the difficulties of this approach. Well, firstly, you'll have to unlearn a lot of the things that you currently think goal setting is or reaching your potential is. You know, I talk about the calendars and the routines and all those things that we abandon, especially if you're like me. I tend to abandon those things. I wasn't able to implement calendars and bar charts and all the diagrams and the goofy stuff. So you'll have to find your way of doing this loosely and just get to work immediately. And next is that you'll have to trust this process. You're gonna be good eventually, but you won't really see it until you're getting close to that point. For example, I'll take learning a language. I have videos where I'm speaking Japanese and playing piano at the same time. I have some videos completely in Japanese, but when I first started learning, I did not think I would be able to do that at all because I could barely say basic sentences and they were confusing me. But as you continue to make progress, what's gonna happen is it looks a little more realistic. That end goal or that end idea you have in mind, it looks a little bit more realistic. And the unfortunate part is that you just have to trust the process and there's no way around that. But it's also good because you don't have anything to overthink and you can just sit there and practice and focus on that day, one day at a time. Which brings me to the next point. Really make it a point to focus on the very next step. You have to do this. Oftentimes people will ask, how fast can I learn this? How often do I have to do this every day? Or how many vocab words a day? How many hours a day? I don't know. You don't know, I don't know, no one knows. You have to figure that out each day as the day shows up. These questions are good. I'm not gonna discredit these questions. They're good questions, but the reality is you have to take these things one day at a time because you don't know. You don't know how many things you're gonna do tomorrow. Next is that you'll have to overcome perfectionism and shiny object syndrome issues. And I have videos on this in particular, but if you don't feel like watching those, just keep that idea in mind. You will have to overcome this and just get it out of your life completely. Both of those things in particular are what give people absolutely no results. So the more you remind yourself of that, and maybe in your past, especially in my past too, if you remind yourself of the progress that you've never made because of these issues, then it'll help you remember this and it'll help you just take action on what you have right now. I think I mentioned this before, but piano in particular, I bought my piano years before I even practiced it. It just sat there in the box. But that's because I was trying to look for the perfect curriculum and the perfect scheme and all that. And there was none. So this is something I really want you all to avoid, or anyone who sees this to just avoid completely. Perfectionism and shiny object syndrome. You've got to get these things out of your life as soon as possible. And lastly, only you have the answer to a lot of the questions that you have. You know, me or anyone else on the internet can give you guidance and documents, and I can give you Anki flashcards and all this other stuff for language learning or music videos, but sometimes a lot of these things will come up to you. I try to be an example of this because everything I know, I pretty much learned in a very unoptimal way until I figured out some sort of optimal way to me, and I just tried it. I didn't look for anyone to co-sign on that. I didn't really look around for answers. The only thing that really gave me results is that I just tried it. And so I want to help you get the confidence to do the same thing. Maybe you think you can learn guitar faster than what I will lay out in the future, or with my language learning video. Maybe you have a better routine. Try that. Take what I say or anyone else on the internet says and take the ideas from that, but at the end of the day, sometimes you just have to answer these things on your own. So that's it for approach 1 and general practice concepts. This has a lot packed into it, so I highly recommend coming back and watching this part in particular over and over again and just getting it down to the point where you kind of know what I'm talking about subconsciously. Now I'm going to talk about the second approach, which is planning out 1 week at a time. Usually at the beginning of the week, just plan out what you think you would do from Monday to Saturday, and then all of the necessary materials that you need underneath that. So who is this for? It's for more seasoned people who have some sort of competency in other areas, and people who really don't have an issue focusing or have the perfectionist or shiny object syndrome issues. So for example, if I were learning triads from a YouTube video. For that entire week, I'm only watching that YouTube video. And I know what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna schedule out the time, schedule out what I saw in the video, and learn each part of the video. You may have to edit this as you go along, but the difference between approach 1 and approach 2 is that you do plan out a little bit. There's really not much difference other than that. And as a note, you will probably graduate from approach 1 to approach 2 in some things, because you'll build up discipline and focus and the ability to show up on days where you don't really feel like doing it. And those little side skills that help you get good at things. But again, I will always recommend approach number 1. So that's approach 2. Approach 3, I call it the Vaughn approach. Now, this approach I do not recommend for 99% of people because it's kind of crazy, but it works. This is not the correct approach either. This is just the way I do things, and I don't even do this in every area of my life. I only do it in particular things. So what to do? Well, you pick a time you want to be at a certain goal, or you want to have something completed, and you lay out every day up until that time. I would also say schedule deliberate days to take off and rest days. This is really important because say you have 4 days on and 1 day off, that 4th day is going to be difficult, but you can look forward to that day off or that time off. I typically do 6 days on, 1 day off, but I also have times where I do 3 on and 1 off. I typically don't do 2 days on and 1 off because, you know, I just feel like I can push 1 more day. But again, this is the intense approach, and I would still recommend approach number 1 for most people. So like language learning, for example, I believe in learning a lot of vocabulary up front because vocabulary is the gatekeeper to language. So for me, I'll say I need to get to 4,000 vocabulary words in 6 weeks. Just something like that. And so I'll divide that into 6 days on, 1 day off in those 6 weeks. With that being said, the main criteria to this approach is that at no point you give in to feelings or emotions or not wanting to do it and all that. This is kind of the robotic approach. There's no emotion and feeling and, you know, fluctuation involved in this. Okay, but this is also why I do not recommend it for most people. And I also don't recommend it for most activities. But I'm gonna get into that in a second. This is also for people with an obsession to get good at that thing, okay? If you're obsessed with just knowing everything about it or knowing how to use it or unlocking your ability in that thing, this is for you. For example, with guitar, that's kind of what I eventually got to. I was obsessed with knowing every note on the fretboard, every triad, every scale, everything. I still don't know it all and I have a long way to go, but I do know a lot now because I had a kind of absolute obsession with improving at that. Same with piano, that's the obsession I have right now. But this is something that you'll have to come to on your own terms. I can't teach you that. No one else can teach you that. This is just something that has to come from within you. And a bonus is if you don't see it as work or you don't see it as a task or a box that you have to check, you more so see it as a result that you just really want. And again, I do not recommend this approach for 99% of people. However, I will say that I was not always a hard worker. I only worked hard at very specific things, but in everything else, I was very lazy. And I cut corners and I skated by on talent, probably like many of you guys. Eventually though, my ability to do things did transfer into those other tasks. One of those was learning software. I didn't like learning software when I started. I just wasn't having fun, but I did do a brute force approach because I knew I could do it. And I don't think I would have gotten there had I not done this in other areas first. I say this to say, eventually you may end up doing this approach, even though right now it may seem unrealistic to you. So who is this approach for? I would really only recommend this for people who have built competency in other things. For example, I'm learning Spanish right now. I already speak Japanese and I have experience in other languages as well that I'll get into on the channel. But for me, I can tell myself that I'm gonna do a certain curriculum for Spanish because I know what it takes already. But I would not do this if this was my first language because I don't know what I'm getting myself into. I hope that makes sense to everyone. Who is this not for? Right away, I'll say if you have consistency issues, you wanna definitely avoid this. And I don't mean the natural human consistency issues, like maybe one day you take a day off when you weren't supposed to. That's totally normal. I have a video that I talk about consistency and riding that wave of ups and downs, but I more so mean you just don't show up at all. So you were supposed to play guitar and you didn't pick it up for 2 weeks, or you didn't pick it up for a week straight, or you have one day where you do a lot and then you just go back to playing video games and then you come back to it in a couple months or whatever. This is what I mean. If you have consistency issues like that, just go with step one, or approach number one. That's the only approach you need to be worrying about. Another one is discipline issues. If you have trouble just doing it when you're not really into it at the time, or taking the necessary steps you need to, or getting through the mundane tasks in order to get to the fun parts, if you have an issue doing that, I would also not recommend this approach. Also, an inability to focus. You can do this approach with ADHD, by the way, or some form of neurodivergence, but you have to you have to remove everything from your room at the time, or your screen, put your phone away, all that kind of stuff, because you can't give your brain options to jump onto. It has to be able to think about whatever and then get back to what you're supposed to be doing. You're right now focus. As a fun fact, this is actually what I do. When I have to do something, or when I want to do something, I have to put everything else away. Otherwise, I'm going to check my phone. I'm going to look at Instagram Reels. If it's on my phone, I'm going to go do something else. I kind of have to lock myself in place and then take action right there. This approach is also not for people who have trouble scheduling their dopamine correctly. What I mean by this is mainly things like video games and social media. None of this in approach 3 can come before your tasks. So say in a day you want to play an instrument and learn a language and go to the gym. At no point in the day should you touch video games or social media until you have done those things. Then all that stuff is free reign. Now notice I'm not saying delete social media completely. I'm not saying delete video games off your PC, uninstall Steam. I'm not saying that. I'm saying each day you want to get those tasks done and then you go have fun. And in this approach, at no point do you dip into those dopamine tasks until you've completed the actual tasks. These are skills, by the way, like scheduling your dopamine correctly. These are skills, by the way, and you can build all of these up. Discipline, focus, all of that. They're like stats for a character, and you can level them up over time. But if you're at a low level, you guys know I like video games, so this is an easy example. If you're at a low level, you can't just go and do an extreme approach. If you're a Pokemon and you're level 5, or like a level 6 Charmander, you're not going to go to the 5th gym leader and say, all right, let's time the battle, let's do this. It's not going to work. Try to keep the same idea with this approach. If you don't have it in you, that's okay. You're just not there, but eventually maybe you'll get there. Most importantly, avoid this approach at all costs if your mental health is not in the right place, or other areas in your life are not in place as well. The reason is because if you have things going on in life that aren't going so well, you have a bunch of other issues that you've been sweeping under the rug, this is not the time to be going intense on things that don't really matter that much. You've got to fix your mental health first, get those other things in life sorted out, and then you can kind of take this approach. Now, that being said, if you just heard all my warnings and all my little labels and all that, and you still want to take this approach, then that means it's probably for you. Just always keep in mind, if it's too much, dial it back. Go back to approach number 1. There's nothing wrong with that. I even do that myself sometimes, and that's just the way life is. Now, what this approach requires, I mentioned it earlier, but the dopamine thing. Do not do anything fun until you have done those other things. That's it, point blank. Otherwise, you will not be able to stick with the schedule that you make. That's just how it's gonna go. So how to structure these with your goals. Not every goal needs the same approach. I call approach number 3 the Vaughn approach, but I don't even take that approach with some things. And I'm Vaughn. So don't think you have to do everything in the same way. Maybe some things you take it a day at a time. Maybe some things you already know what to do, so you take a more rigid approach. It's all up to you. I'll use some examples in my own life and my past, and maybe you can get some ideas from that. So when I started MMA, I don't do much MMA these days because I'm not trying to be professional and all that. And I want to keep as many brain cells as I have, the few that's left. But when I started MMA, I pretty much started with approach 3, and that was it. It was kind of a non-negotiable thing. I always went to practice. I never skipped. I went twice a day. If I could, I would go 3 times a day when I was in college. But for me, that's because I was obsessed with being a good fighter at that time. That's really all I thought about. I was constantly watching fights, analyzing footage, looking at defense, offense, all that kind of stuff. I was completely obsessed with it. But something on the other end, like guitar, I tend to fluctuate between approach 1, 2, and 3. I started out with approach 1. That's how I got a lot of things done, just a day-by-day approach. Then eventually it went to 2, and then it went to 3. Same with Spanish. I tend to fluctuate between 2 and 3 because I already know what I'm getting myself into. But again, if I didn't do that, it would just be approach 1. All of this stuff being said, with my examples and all, whatever you have going on, it will change. It'll go from approach 1 to 2 to 3. Maybe it'll stay in 3. Maybe you'll have an obsession. Maybe you already have an obsession. Just work with what you have and make your own rule set for this. Quick note on avoiding burnout. I said this earlier, but do the harder tasks first. This is going to help you spend all of your energy earlier in the day when you have it, rather than trying to do it later. Or if you're a night person and you have the discipline to not touch those other things, schedule it when you're most energetic. I know some people get their energy at night. That's when you get the most done. Maybe that's when you play guitar or study that language. Just make sure you're actually doing that thing and not just saying that you're gonna do it. Another one is rewarding yourself with those other things like social media and video games. That's kind of how I treat my routine. I don't touch anything until I'm done. And then I just pretend I'm not a productive guy at all. I play video games if that's in my life at the time, or I scroll social media. I look at reels, I watch YouTube videos, I do all that stuff. I've said this before, but social media, I don't keep it on my phone at all until I'm done with everything for the day. And then I re-download it and log in and use it. And then when I'm done, I take it back off my phone. This is how I do it though. You don't have to, but I find that if it's on my phone, I'm gonna end up clicking it and get going. And then all of a sudden I lose an hour of my day. So this is just something that I have to do. Same with anything else. I don't really have it available until I'm done with everything else. You might want to keep that in mind for yourself because that may be what you require too. The next one is be okay with making a lot of mistakes or miscalculating your competency. This is just normal. We often overshoot. I know I do. I tend to think I can do something in the span of a month and it's like not realistic at all. And so I have to dial it back. That's totally normal though. I bring this up in the burnout section though because some people punish themselves for not keeping up some unrealistic standard. Even like on my end, right, on YouTube, there will be YouTubers who say, get up at 4 o'clock and do this and do that and blah, blah, blah. First of all, a lot of them are lying, but second of all, that's not realistic for you. So always keep that in mind. Even things I say, whether it's this video, other videos, maybe that's not realistic for you. That comes before anything else that you hear from some random people on the internet. The next is to schedule some time off. I believe I brought this up in approach number 3. But in general, no matter what approach you're doing, just schedule some time off. Another one I'll add is that any goal you make, or anything you do really, don't make it off of a basis of what you used to do. So for example, if you're learning piano now, and you've had a bunch of times where you started piano and you stopped, and you started and you stopped, forget all that. Whatever, you wasted time. Congratulations. Get on to today and making your routine work for you from now on. And lastly, I'll say challenge yourself. I know this is strange to have in a burnout section, but I noticed the more results you can see sooner, the easier it is to actually stick to things. Anyways, with all of this, of course, you'll have to cater it to how you live your life. I can only give you so much and examples from my own life, and hopefully you can take a lot from that. But at the end of the day, it's still you that creates all this stuff for you. Anyways, that is all. If you're still here, please like the video if you found it helpful, if you actually like it, and subscribe, or I'm gonna send 3 green shells to get you. Love you guys, and I will see you in the next one. Peace.